Radio, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the good people here at First Unitarian Church. We are so excited about this event, an opportunity to bring Medea Benjamin from CODEPINK here to Louisville. We're greatly appreciative of her taking her time to get here and speak to us about important events. Today's event that features Medea Benjamin is sponsored by the Louisville Fellowship of Reconciliation and co-sponsored by Louisville Church Women United, St. William's Catholic Church, the Peace and Social Justice Concern Committee of the Louisville Friends Community. So we want to thank Carmichael's Book for their participation in today's event, and we want to express our gratitude to First Unitarian Church for lending us their extraordinary facility and supporting the event that features CODEPINK's Medea Benjamin. We also want to acknowledge Maxwell Mitchell, who is live streaming this event for us. And First Unitarian Church, Jim Brown, who is acting as our sound technician today. It took quite a bit of work to put this off, to pull this off early with Medea Benjamin. She's such a busy lady. So at this time, I'd like the folks that served on the Medea Benjamin committee to stand because they certainly deserve some special recognition. So if you were on that Medea Benjamin committee, please stand. Also, the FOR Steering Committee, if you're on the FOR Steering Committee, please stand. This would not have been possible without the help of the Kathy Ford actually was the leader of the Medea Benjamin meeting, and she worked extraordinarily hard to put this together. So we really appreciate it. Before I explain the schedule and introduce John Gage, I'd like, I just said that. So the rest of this program, it goes like this. First, the Louisville Fellowship of Reconciliation. First, our own John Gage will perform songs that advocate for peace and justice. LFOR's Beverly Harmon will introduce Medea Benjamin. There will be a Q&A session following Medea Benjamin's presentation. I will announce the beginning of the Q&A session, but Medea will conduct that session herself. And if you notice, there's a microphone up here, and so we'll ask people to come to the microphone if they want to ask a question. The book signing session will occur in First Unitarian Social Hall, right back to those two double doors. We're encouraging you to stay for the book signing session because it will provide a chance to purchase Medea's book, the latest book, Ukraine, Russia, Making Sense Out of the Senseless War. And it will give you an opportunity to meet Medea Benjamin. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you singer, songwriter, teacher, director of the radio program Homefront, and the recipient of the 2013 Anne Braden Humanitarian Award, John Gage.
Good to see you. This is a great honor to me to share this time with you, to share some music that I've been mulling over for a good time, a good long while, like 50 years. Still trying to remember the words. But I'm deeply moved to be here, and I'm thankful to have a little part of this wonderful activist community. I think I know where we are and what we're about, and I hope to represent that today. Inspire some hope. And Kathy Ford reminded me of two important people who shaped my life forever. You had invited me in on this activist circle and taught me what to do. That's George and Jean Edwards. This first song is by Travis Edmondson. It was sung all during the 60s and 70s by me a lot. And finally, a couple of years ago, I wrote a whole new song for that melody. This weary world has had its fill of words of war on every hill. The time has come for peaceful days, for peaceful folks of peaceful ways. That was the original song part of it. This is my part. Find your voice, speak your mind, bring peace and justice to humankind. Be the eyes for a world gone blind. Find your voice, speak your mind. Wake up in the morning, read the news. It's very clear to see the whole world is confused. Cynical voices say you're too weak, too small. If you try to fly, you're bound to fall. A courageous heart, so hard to find, calls to you. Speak your mind. Stand up tall, stand and be strong. Lift your voice, sing your song. The pathway to peace lies within. Your heart holds the love for this wounded world to mend. In the stillness of a sunset, our prayerful voices blend, and a new day is dawning, a new world begins. A courageous heart, so hard to find, calls to you. Speak your mind. Stand up tall, stand and be strong. Lift your voice, sing your song. Find your voice, speak your mind. Bring peace and justice to humankind. Be the eyes for a world gone blind. Find your voice, speak your mind. Second time, I wrote quickly one day. I was playing for a Jane Goodall event down on the river, and I thought that afternoon it would really be good if I had a different song to sing instead of the same old songs, although I love them. So I had this epiphany, and an old song came out, a brand new song. I think you know it. It's my song that's my faith statement. I think of Dr. King's words so many years ago. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In that spirit, we'll sing this song for you and remind us, change takes a long time, but it does happen. We are the bearers of this message of hope. We are the ones who believe One morning I woke up not so long ago, and words were forming in my mind, and those words were, no one seems to believe we can have a world without war. And that is precisely what makes it so. So I thought about that a long time. And I think what we need to do is go ahead and dare to dream. Dare to envision a world without war. And we are the ones. And we are a significant minority. So we have hard work to do. We must remain faithful to this message. We're the bearers of hope, and it's more than just wishing. It's more than just wishing. By our beliefs, by our actions, we open the door to a new world coming inexorably as a mighty train. There's a mighty train coming, it's on the way. There's a mighty train coming, it's on the way. There's a mighty train coming, you can hear those rails a-humming. There's a mighty train coming, it's on the way. And freedom is a-coming, it's on the way. Freedom is a coming, it's on the way. Hear those distant drums a drumming. This freedom is a coming, it's on the way. Justice is a coming, it's on the way. We need it, hold it. Justice is a coming, it's on the way. All earth's children sharing equally her bounty. This justice is a coming, it's on the way. And there's a new day dawning, it's on the way. There's a new day dawning, it's on the way. The light of love transforming gives the darkness fair warning. There's a new day dawning, it's on the way. There's a world without war, it's on the way. There's a world without war, it's on the way. There's a mighty train coming to a peaceful world to explore. 'Cause there's a world without war on its way. There's a world without war on its way.
It's going to take me a moment to get set up here. There we go. It's going to take me a moment to get set up here and get the hair out of my face. It's a great joy for me not only to welcome Medea Benjamin, but to see all my friends here, so many of you. This is truly a gathering of peaceful people seeking more peace than we have right now. I want to say that much of what my short introduction of Medea will be based on is the Wikipedia article about her. It is extremely long, and I urge, because it's a fascinating article, but I urge you all to read it once you've left here today. I'm going to choose the parts of her life that I think will resonate with all of us here in Louisville, because many of us here have shared the same experiences that she has across her active life. She's played many roles across her life, and today she'll be playing at least 3 of them: communicator, researcher, and author, and anti-war activist. When I read this biography of her, I saw that her desire for adventure and for curiosity about the world turned her into the global citizen that she is today. When she arrived, her parents named her Susan. But during her first year, her freshman year at Tufts University, she renamed herself after the Greek mythological character Medea. I'm quoting someone. She liked how Medea sounded, and she had heard a feminist interpretation of the Greek tragedy, suggesting that Medea had never killed her children and was only blamed for it by patriarchal traditions. While there at Tufts, she also joined the Students for a Democratic Society. Later, she dropped out of school and hitchhiked through Europe and Africa, teaching English classes to earn money. Returning to the States, she went to Columbia University and received master's degrees in public health, and then from the New School, a master's in economics. And then she traveled again, working from her academic career, spending from her academic career. For 10 years, she worked as an economist and nutritionist in Latin America and Africa for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, learning all the time, for the World Health Organization, the Swedish International Development Agency, and the Institute for Food and Development Policy. Just 2 more items, and then I'll move on. In 1988, with her husband and a friend, Medea Benjamin co-founded the San Francisco-based Global Exchange, which advocates fair trade alternatives to what she describes as corporate globalization. And now that I've met her today, I'll never drink another cup of fair trade coffee at Honey Brothers without thinking of Medea. Thank you so much. She's been incredibly active across her life, and I'll leave that up to Wikipedia to tell you all about that. But what I want to mention are 2 awards which she has received, and she has received many from many places in the world that ring here with us. In 2010, she received the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And in 2012, she won the Marjorie Kellogg National Peacemaker Award and the Thomas Merton Center Peace Award. Medea has just written her latest book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of Senseless Conflict. And on that basis, she was invited to speak to us today because none of us know enough about what led up to the war in Ukraine and the roles that the United States and NATO played in bringing it about. She's here to tell us about that. She's also been, on many occasions, with the organization she co-founded, CODEPINK, Women for Peace, which advocated for an end to the Iraq War, the prevention of future wars, and social justice. She has been frequently to Gaza to Egypt to Israel. And at the end of her talk about the war in Ukraine, she's going to bring that into her program for us. So, Medea, you have our process here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, John, for that beautiful music. And at this point in our history, it's so important to envision a world without war. I came to talk about Ukraine, and people are saying, is that war still going on? We do have to talk about Gaza, because I think from the heads I see going up and down that our hearts are breaking. And that we can't live in a world like this. This is not right. This is not how we want to be in this world. And I have been going around the country for the last year and a half since the Ukraine war began, calling on people to say, we have to look for negotiated solutions. And I've been protested at so many places that I've been to. I've had presentations canceled at churches like this. I've had presentations canceled at universities, at bookstores. And I have seen friends that I have had all my life, Quaker friends, people in Veterans for Peace, people in social justice groups that say, Medea, I just can't agree with you on this war. And I think we have to say, just like many of you say, war is the problem, war is not the solution. So I'm really torn because I want to just talk, but then I also saw this beautiful setup that they have to show video, and we have an 18-minute video about Ukraine, and I think that people have kind of forgotten what the Ukraine war is all about, and it might be good to show the video. I narrated it, I wrote it, it's kind of a summary of the book, which I hope many of you will purchase, because it's important we have that background, we're able to talk from a place of real understanding to people who do say to us, well, this war is different. So if you don't mind, I think we'll go and show the 18-minute video, and then I'll give an update from there, and we'll talk about the war in Gaza, the similarities, the differences, the actions, where we can go from here. So let's show the video, if that's okay. Thanks. Let's talk about the heartbreaking war in Ukraine and what we can do to try to end it. Every day the war rages on, civilians and soldiers are being killed. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee and seek asylum in foreign lands. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, and infrastructure have been reduced to rubble. We wrote this book to try to help people make sense of a war that should never have happened. A war that has raged on for months and might well rage on for years. A war that could lead to a nuclear confrontation. A war that must be stopped. We know that people have very different opinions about this conflict, and we hope that our book and this talk will foster respectful dialogue. We have not tried to justify or excuse Russia's invasion of Ukraine because we do not think it is justifiable or excusable. We hope it can help you understand the context, the background, and the actions of all the parties that led to this crisis. As U.S. citizens, we have very little hope of influencing the Russian government, but we should be able to influence our own government, which is why it's so important to look at the role the United States has played in fomenting the conflict. Let's look at two elements of U.S. involvement that we highlight in our book: NATO expansion and the events of 2014. Western leaders call NATO a defensive military alliance, but NATO was formed to defend Western Europe from invasion by the Soviet Union. That mission was accomplished when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. NATO should have been dissolved at the end of the Cold War, along with the Warsaw Pact, which was NATO's counterpart in the Eastern Bloc. Instead, NATO reinvented itself to justify its continued existence. It expanded all the way to Russia's borders, despite many promises that it would not do so, and ignoring warnings from experienced US and Western diplomats that this would lead to a predictable yet entirely avoidable crisis with Russia, as in fact it has. You can see the map showing the various waves of expansion in which NATO incorporated former Soviet republics and Russia's European neighbors. In 2018, the antagonism reached new heights when NATO, under US pressure, publicly promised membership to the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Georgia. While no definite date was set, NATO began supplying increased levels of military aid and training to Ukraine, including Ukraine in military exercises. So Russia certainly had legitimate concerns about Ukraine's involvement in an ever-expanding military alliance that was encircling Russia with powerful military forces and had already unleashed aggressive wars and occupations in Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan in 2001, and Libya and Syria in 2011. The other event that served to set the stage for the Russian invasion in 2022 was the coup in Ukraine in 2014. The 2014 upheavals began with massive peaceful protests against the corrupt pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. Unfortunately, though, these protests turned violent and were co-opted by neo-Nazi groups that refused to go along with an internationally negotiated plan for a political transition, and instead, they spearheaded a coup. The extent of US support and involvement in this coup is still shrouded in secrecy, as are previous US-backed coups in Iran, Chile, and many other countries. But a leaked audio tape of Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and US Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt exposed their roles as coup managers as they handpicked what positions each of their Ukrainian collaborators would assume in the post-coup government. Although the original peaceful protests in Ukraine were about wanting to join the European Union, Nuland dismissed the European Union's more popular choice for Prime Minister, Vitaly Klitschko, with her infamous F the EU remark. According to a Gallup poll conducted in April 2014, nearly 50% of Ukrainians rejected the legitimacy of the post-coup government. This led to rebellions in parts of Ukraine that were ethnically and culturally close to Russia. In Crimea, a peninsula on the Black Sea with a mostly Russian-speaking population that was part of Russia from 1783 until 1954, as well as in the eastern provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. In Odessa, 42 anti-coup protesters were burned to death by a mob on May 2nd, 2014. The new government in Ukraine was rejected by the parliament in Crimea, and a referendum to rejoin Russia passed overwhelmingly and was accepted by Russia but not recognized by other countries. The provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk also passed referendums declaring themselves independent from Ukraine, leading to a civil war that killed an estimated 14,000 people. Many Ukrainian military units based in this region defected to self-declared people's republics or refused to fight their own people. So the Ukrainian government formed new National Guard units to fight the separatists. These included units like the Azov Battalion, recruited from the same neo-Nazi groups that took up arms to spearhead the coup in Kiev in February 2014. The worst fighting of the Civil War ended in February 2015 with the signing of the Minsk II Accord. This was drafted by France, Germany, and Russia, and agreed to by Ukraine and the self-declared republics. It set up a ceasefire and a buffer zone between the warring parties and was monitored by 1,300 monitors and staff from the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. While the ceasefire largely held from 2015 to 2022, the Ukrainian government failed to implement the political aspects of the Minsk II agreement. It had agreed to grant Donetsk and Luhansk a new autonomous status, but each time the Ukrainian government tried to move forward on this, extreme right-wing forces reexerted their power and insisted that Ukraine must instead keep fighting to recover its lost territories. NATO and the US also bear responsibility for the failure of Minsk II. Despite officially claiming to support the agreement, NATO and the US, under both Trump and Biden, kept building up Ukraine's military, encouraging the Ukrainian government to believe it could eventually recover Donbass and Crimea by force, and that the US and NATO would support that. As tensions were reaching a boiling point in December 2021, Russia took the initiative of drafting two mutual security treaties, one between Russia and the United States and the other between Russia and NATO. These were not take-it-or-leave-it demands, but drafts for negotiation. Unfortunately, the United States and NATO summarily dismissed Russia's proposals. By building up Ukraine's military, promising Ukraine NATO membership, and dismissing negotiations, the US and its allies turned Ukraine into a dangerous weapon in their revived Cold War against Russia. Then, in the days leading up to February's Russia invasion, the OSCE ceasefire monitors documented thousands of explosions around the ceasefire line in Donbass, mostly on the Donetsk and Luhansk side, indicating a major escalation of artillery fire by Ukrainian government forces. So even in the immediate causes of the war, it is deceptive to describe the invasion as unprovoked, as Biden and US officials routinely do. By early 2022, Russia had amassed large military forces near Belarus' border and its own borders with Ukraine, all the while denying that it had plans to invade. It also formally recognized Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent countries. On February 24th, Russia invaded. The invasion was illegal on many counts. It was not an act of self-defense, and it certainly was not authorized by the United Nations. Under international law, including the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the UN Charter, the invasion was an illegal crime of aggression. Russia did not just move its invading forces into Donbass to support the breakaway republics, but it launched offensive towards the capital Kyiv and the second largest city, Kharkiv, in the northeast, and into the southern part of Ukraine from Crimea. Western analysts generally agree that Russia must have hoped to take quickly Kyiv and install a friendly government, but it encountered strong resistance from Ukrainian forces and was forced to withdraw from the north. Ukraine's western neighbors responded to the invasion by granting asylum to millions of refugees, while the US and other NATO countries poured billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine, stepped up their training of Ukrainian military, and provided it with intelligence to accurately attack important Russian targets. There has been little or no accountability for the weapons flooding into Ukraine. There are reports that as little as 30% of them may be reaching the front lines because they are either destroyed by Russian missiles or siphoned off into the black market, where they could end up in the hands of the Islamic State, neo-Nazis, or other dangerous groups around the world. This was precisely why the US Congress prohibited the transfer of US weapons to the Azov Regiment in 2018, as it became a magnet and a hub for international right-wing militant networks. Yet after the Russian invasion, all restraints were lifted, and thousands of tons of powerful and advanced weapons have poured in over the Polish border. There was so little debate about this in the US that when Congress passed an enormous $40 billion package for Ukraine, with most of the money to be spent on more and more lethal weapons for up to another decade, not a single Democrat voted against it. Not even Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who cast the lone, wise, and prophetic vote against the disastrous war in Afghanistan in 2001. In our book, we explain the peace negotiations in Turkey in March that could have already ended this war, and the largely unreported role of the US and British governments in killing those talks. The talks during the first month of the war produced the contours of a 15-point peace plan for a ceasefire, a Russian withdrawal, and a future for Ukraine as an independent, peaceful, and neutral country. On March 27th, President Zelensky told a national TV audience, "Our goal is obvious, peace and the restoration of normal life in our native state as soon as possible." Under the draft agreement, Ukraine would neither be a military ally of the United States and NATO, nor of Russia, with no foreign military bases or installations on its territory. Ukraine would get security guarantees from other countries. Russian speakers in Ukraine would be free to speak, read, and study in Russian. And the future of Crimea and Donbass would be determined by an internationally accepted political process during a transition period of several years. But none of that came to pass. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson went to Kyiv on April 9th and told Prime Minister Zelensky that the UK would not be party to any agreement between Ukraine and Russia, and that the collective West, as he called it, saw a chance to press Russia and was determined to make the most of it. Turkish diplomats who had been mediating the ceasefire talks reported that US Defense Secretary Austin delivered a similar message to Zelensky, and that these messages effectively killed their peace efforts. So early hopes for a negotiated peace were dashed, largely as a result of US and British determination to weaken Russia, even at the cost of rivers of Ukrainian blood in an open-ended war that could last for years. The undermining of ceasefire talks was a tragic lost opportunity. Since the talks were abandoned, the slaughter and destruction has continued, with hundreds of Ukrainians killed every day. Russia has taken control of more territory, and despite the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia now occupies 20% of Ukraine. The sanctions against Russia have backfired, leading to soaring energy prices worldwide, while reduced grain exports have led to widespread hunger, particularly in the global south. Europe is facing an energy and home heating crisis. Meanwhile, no sign has honestly or publicly explained what its goals are in this war, or why they can possibly justify the total destruction of Ukraine and even the greater danger of nuclear war. Even the old war hawk Henry Kissinger is warning that US policy has blundered to the brink of a world war with no clear purpose or endgame in sight. He told the Wall Street Journal, "We are at the edge of war with Russia and China on issues which we partly created, without any concept of how this is going to end or what it's supposed to lead to." And here at home, we are told we don't have the funds for a decent healthcare system, or free college education, or housing for the unhoused. We cannot allow our public funds to be squandered on yet another unwinnable war and an even more all-consuming military budget. Governments in the global south are watching the impacts of this war plunge millions of their people into hunger and famine, while Europe's energy crisis is already sinking the continent into a recession. We in the US have been relatively unscathed by this war compared to many people elsewhere, but we are already facing rising prices which will get worse as the war continues, and the US will not be exempt from the impacts of this looming global recession. With climate chaos jeopardizing the very future of life on this planet, this war is derailing our efforts to confront the climate crisis. Instead of a Green New Deal, we are now watching a mad scramble to produce more oil, gas, and coal as energy companies reap record profits from their disaster capitalism. And while the climate heats up and governments and corporations shift their already inadequate climate plans into reverse, Russia and the US are threatening us with yet another existential disaster, a nuclear apocalypse. We understand that some people may disagree with our analysis of this conflict, but hopefully we can all agree that we must do whatever we can to bring this war to an end. And that's why CODEPINK is part of a coalition called Peace in Ukraine. We pressure our members of Congress and the White House to call for negotiations. We call on the media to promote the voice of peacemakers. We distribute our messages via social media, and we educate the public, including getting our book into libraries and classrooms. And we encourage you to join us. We must act now to say, stop the bloodshed, stop the bombing, stop the madness. We must work together to demand a ceasefire and negotiations, not more war. Thank you. So I think this might be a refresher for some of you, and hopefully some new information for others of you. Since we did this video and wrote the book, there has been the long-anticipated counteroffensive that Ukraine was supposed to start in the summertime, and it didn't start it, and then it got to the fall and didn't start, and then finally it started the counteroffensive. And that was really from pressure from the Western countries, and particularly the United States, saying, we gave you all these weapons, you better show something positive on the battlefield. And so Ukraine has thrown so many of its own soldiers into this fight, and has been losing so many soldiers in this battle and not gaining territory. And this is something that our own Pentagon knew, because there were leaked Pentagon reports that came out saying that no matter what happens with this counteroffensive, it's not going to be enough to make any real decisive change on the battlefield, because this is a war that doesn't have a military solution. It gives me chills just to say that, because the people in the know say there is no military solution unless you really want to take us to a nuclear war, and then there's just no solution either. And yet the politicians are stuck on keeping this war going. And I've had people who say, well, it's not true that the West stopped the negotiations. It's absolutely true that the West stopped the negotiations. And we have so many different confirmations of that. We have reports that came out in the Turkish media, because it was being mediated by the President of Turkey. We have reports that came out in the Ukraine media by pro-Ukraine government media. And then we had interviews done separately by the heads of state of France and Germany at that time, Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel, who confirmed, indeed. And Naftali Bennett, who now is involved in this horrific war in Israel, saying that the West blocked the negotiations. The West blocked the negotiations because we wanted to weaken Russia. And so this goes on and on and on. And the West sending in more and more dangerous weapons, violating international treaties, for example, by sending in cluster bombs, something that 123 nations said was so appalling that it had to be banned because it keeps killing people, children, farmers, long after the fighting. Sending in munitions with depleted uranium, that we have seen what that does in Iraq with generations of children born with horrific deformities because of cancer. And sending in longer range missiles like these ATACMS that the US says, well, you can have them, but don't use them to go into Russian territory. And of course, these are being used to go into Russian territory. And you can imagine the Ukrainians are saying, the Russians brought the war to us, why shouldn't we bring it to them? But it means more and more danger of having a wider and wider war. I was in Ukraine over the summer, and I talked to a lot of Ukrainians. And of course, they are so angry at Russia, and they want to keep fighting, and they want to beat Russia, and you can understand that. Their loved ones are being killed every single day. But when you talk to them about where is this going and what's the solution, some of them would take me aside and say, we can't talk openly about this. It's treasonous to say anything other than we have to keep fighting till victory. And when you say, does victory include taking back Crimea, which is so important to Russia for its base there, for the port it has there, for the fact that the majority of people in Crimea are ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, have said over and over again they want to be part of Russia. And the Ukrainians I talk to say, shh, we're not allowed to talk about that. So what have we created there? I mean, it's so cruel for Ukrainians to keep this war going, even if many Ukrainians want to keep the war going. That, of course, doesn't include Ukrainians who live in Crimea, Ukrainians who live in the Donbass. And yet, it is the United States that is keeping this war going because it's the United States that's preventing peace talks from getting serious. Now, there are very unserious peace talks going on. In fact, just this weekend, there are peace talks, and I put that in quotations, happening in Malta, where the Ukrainians have invited many members of the global community to come together and look at their peace plan. But this peace plan is not serious. This peace plan says Russia has to leave, that we will be a NATO country, that Russia will be tried for war crimes, and Russia will pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And you might say, well, that might all be just. Except it's not going to happen. That is a negotiating position. That's your starting position. Just like Russia has its starting position saying, we control these 4 areas of Ukraine, even though they don't control all those areas, and other demands that Russia is making. Those are starting positions for negotiations. Those aren't serious peace talks. And you know why the talks in Malta are really not serious peace talks? Because Russia is not invited to attend. So how can you have peace talks without Russia there? And there are so many people, including members of Congress that many of us might have a warm spot in our heart for, like Bernie Sanders, who have said, you cannot talk to Putin. In fact, we did a protest a couple of weeks ago before this latest round of conflict in Gaza in his office, in which people got arrested because we had Bernie Sanders' own quotes before the Russian invasion saying this is a complicated situation and it can only be solved when all the sides come together and talk. But once this war started, he changed his tune and said you can't talk to Putin. And we say, well, who can you talk to then? You have to talk to Putin. He's the one that you need to talk to. You have peace talks with your adversaries, not with your friends. And so it has been just insane in the Congress, this issue around Ukraine. Insane because the only people that have some sanity when it comes to this have been the most insane members of Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And your Senator Rand Paul has been one of the most sane voices on this, saying, why are we pouring billions and billions and billions more dollars into it? And yet Bernie Sanders is saying you can't talk to Putin. It does not make sense. And now Biden has come up and said, now we're asking for $106 billion more. $106 billion more, and you know what they're doing? So conniving. They're putting in the money for Ukraine, which is $61 billion, the majority of that money. And they know that there's this group of Republicans that doesn't want that money to go through, wants to block it. So they've thrown in the money for Israel into that package, $14 billion in there, because they know those same Republicans want to give money to Israel. And then they say, well, you know, there are some of these progressive members like the Squad that are starting to question this war in Ukraine, and you know, maybe they're not going to like spending the $61 billion. So let's throw in some money for humanitarian aid in there. So they'll have to vote for the package. And then just to make sure they'll get all the Republicans, they're throwing in some money for ICE and the border. I mean, it is really disgusting what is happening. And this is a Congress where when it comes to Ukraine, now despite the one-sided view, the lack of context we get in the mainstream media, 55% of the American people, according to the latest CNN poll, said they don't want the US to send more money to Ukraine. And when it comes to Gaza, it's even larger. 66% of the American people say they want a ceasefire. So you would think that 55% of members of Congress would say no to more money to Ukraine, and 66% of members of Congress would say time for a ceasefire. But that ain't how it is. That's not the way it's going. So let me just first say about Ukraine, and then we can go to Gaza. When it comes to Ukraine, we have to be a much, much, much stronger voice. You know why? Because the side that wants to keep the war going is very well funded. They include the weapons manufacturers, and they got a lot of money and a lot of lobbyists. They have more lobbyists than there are members of Congress. It includes the dirty oil companies, because they are making a fortune on replacing Russian energy that was going to Europe. And so they want to keep that going. And then there is a very well-oiled pro-Ukraine lobby that includes many Ukrainian Americans. And I see them on a regular basis in the halls of Congress. They're flown in from cities all over the United States, and they're pounding the doors of our Congress to say, yes, we need the $61 billion to guarantee this war will keep going for a year. And you know why they want this big package. They call it one and done. Meaning, let's not ask for 10 billion here and 10 billion here and 10 billion here. Let's go for the big package because they know the American people don't want this. And they know as the elections are coming up, it's not a popular issue. So let's put it all in, get it done quickly. And then you see these pro-Ukrainian groups that are coming to Congress. You go down the halls of Congress and you see stand with Ukraine, stand with Israel, stand with Ukraine, stand with Israel, all over the place. They have united these two issues in a very strange way, because if you look at the reality, Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and Russia is an occupier. And in the case of Gaza and the West Bank, you have Israel being the invading force, Israel being the occupier, and Gaza being the invaded. But yet, they say stand with Ukraine, stand with Israel, instead of stand with Ukraine, stand with Palestine. So we have the money that's on the other side, and well-oiled lobby. And that's why there are members of Congress who say to us literally, we would like to do something with you, but we don't hear enough from our base. And that's why 30 progressive members of Congress, as we said, way back in October of last year, signed a letter saying, in addition to giving the economic and military aid, they didn't even say no more military aid. They said, in addition to that, let's try starting negotiations. They were so pilloried by their own Democratic Party that they withdrew it within 24 hours and have remained silent since then. And so one of the members of the Progressive Caucus said to me, we need to hear more from the base. And that's why we have those little pieces of paper right there. And raise your hand if you've never used a QR code. Be honest. So some of you here. This is the simplest thing to do, and it's really fun. Just put your camera on the QR code, and this little thing will pop up, and there you'll get the petition. Sign the petition. If you could do that while we're talking, that would be great. It's on your chairs. And that's a petition, but we also have on that little piece of paper the phone numbers for your congresspeople and your senators. Now, Mitch McConnell is just awful on these issues. I mean, he's awful on every issue, but really, really awful on this issue. And Rand Paul, you never know where he's going to come down on stuff. And awful on domestic issues. So they need to hear from us. So, yeah.
Old-fashioned paper petition with ink pens in the social hall.
Excellent, excellent. So that's the action, and we really, really, really need you to sign those petitions and to call. But the other issue is, how do we organize and who do we organize? And so I just wanted to tell you some of the things that I've been involved with to try to get more energy going around calling for ceasefire negotiations around Ukraine. One is we work with the Conference of Mayors that represent 1,300 mayors all around the country. You go to any city around the United States, and you will see the disasters of the poverty and the inequality in our cities. You will see so many people without homes. You will see so many people who can't afford the rent. You will see so many people, young people, who are mired in student debt, and so many people who still have a horrific problem trying to get health care. And the mayors understand that problem, as well as potholes in the streets and other infrastructure issues. And so we managed to get through the National Conference of Mayors a resolution passed saying we need that money here in our communities to deal with these very dire issues that we are facing every single day, instead of continuing a war that must be solved through negotiations. Now, we are in a place of worship right now, and many of you, I think, are involved in faith-based communities. Well, we thought, look, we don't want to be seen saying that the people that we are working with are Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, the Freedom Caucus, the Republican Party. We want people who really share our values on all kinds of things. And so let's go to the faith-based community. And it was before the holiday season at the end of last year, and we thought, all right, with the context of all these people saying, you know, we've got to win in Ukraine, it would be great if we could get 100 leaders in the faith-based community to come out and call for negotiations. And that was our goal, and it was my group, CODEPINK, and it was the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And we came together in a very short time with that goal of getting 100 leaders, and we got 1,400 leaders. And so we started then raising funds and putting money into ads in religious papers, like Sojourners and others, to say, let's support the Pope's efforts at a ceasefire. People have asked, what about the environmental community that is so organized? Can't we get them understanding that if this goes to nuclear war, that's it for the environment? Understanding how disastrous war is for the environment. And we do have a petition, we have been getting some groups, but I do want to say it's been very hard to get environmentalists to understand just how horrific war, and this particular war, is for the environment and why it's so important for them to join forces. So any of you that work in the environmental community, let's talk afterwards about how we could build more links with the environmental community on this issue. Some of the other things that we have been doing is knocking on the doors of Congress, as I mentioned, and working in the international community. And that's where I really get a lot of hope. This summer, we organized a conference in Vienna, a peace conference. And Vienna is one of the only neutral countries left in Europe. And we thought, well, that's a great place to have a peace conference. And we organized to get representatives from 32 countries together. And 2 days before the conference was supposed to take place, the trade union that was giving us their conference center decided to pull the plug. And it pulled the plug because the Ukrainian ambassador to Austria had put so much pressure on them to not allow us to have a peace conference there. And the center where we were going to have our press conference pulled the plug as well. And we recognized that it's not just in the United States, it's all over Europe. It's very, very hard to talk about ceasefire. But nevertheless, we found another place. We came together, we had a great conference. We also had people from Ukraine, we had people from Russia, and we came away with ideas of how to mobilize and organize together, which we have been doing. And we will continue to do, because there is a very different sentiment globally, and especially in the global south. And this issue of what's happening with Israel and Ukraine only accentuates that, because there are many people in the global south as well as leaders in the global south that don't believe that the West has any moral authority anymore. They have looked at even just modern history of what the US and the West have been doing. Just even in the last 20 years, how the US responded to the 9/11 attacks by causing so much death and destruction and mayhem around the world. And they've looked at how the US and the West have responded in the case of Ukraine by not wanting to see negotiations go forward. And they don't want to take a side. And now, when it comes to the issue of Gaza, they just see how the U.S. wants to blindly support Israel, as the U.S. and the West have been doing for decades. They understand that the war in Gaza did not start on October 7th. They understand that the war against the Palestinian people has been going on since the foundation of the State of Israel. They understand that the US and the West have been giving this rock-solid support towards Israel and just mouthing and mouthing and mouthing these platitudes about a two-state solution without doing anything about it. In fact, doing just the opposite, which is green-lighting Israeli settlements that make a two-state solution impossible, green-lighting Israeli military buildup and daily oppression against the Palestinian people. The US giving $3.8 billion every single year. And we see what happened just the other day at the United Nations when the vote took place. The vote took place at the United Nations General Assembly because they couldn't get it past the Security Council because the United States would not allow a call for a ceasefire, would not support a call for a ceasefire, would not even support a call for a humanitarian truce. It is so painful to think that our own country will not support a humanitarian truce. And so they had a vote at the United Nations where 120 countries, if you can't pass the Security Council, they take it to the General Assembly, which is the global community. And there they have 120 countries voting in favor of a humanitarian truce against a mere 14 countries, of course, the biggest one being the United States, and of course Israel, being against a humanitarian truce. So what does that say about the global community? It says that the global community has a heart. It says that the global community is watching what's happening and wants to see an end to the fighting. And so as we move towards the question and answer part of this discussion, I want to echo the voice, going back to Ukraine, of somebody who I think represents the global majority, and that is the president of Brazil, President Lula. Because he was invited to the White House by Biden, and Biden said to him, you have to join with 40 other countries that are now sending weapons to Ukraine, and you have to send weapons to Ukraine as well. And he came out of that talk with Biden and said openly in a press conference, we are not going to send weapons to Ukraine. He said, Ukraine does not need more weapons. What this conflict needs is interlocutors who will talk to the Russians about the horrific mistake they made by invading Ukraine, and will talk to the Ukrainians about how they have to move this to the peace table. And he says, we do not want to join this war. We want to end this war. And that's the sentiment, not only in the global South and the global majority. I think now we know from the opinion polls that is the sentiment of the people of the United States as well. We want to end the war in Ukraine, and we want a ceasefire immediately to stop the killing in Gaza. So this is a time in our history when we are not being represented by the people who are supposed to represent us, and where we have to say, not another nickel, not another dime, no more money for Israel's crimes, not another nickel, not another dime. We don't want to keep the war in Ukraine going. And if anything, I think we want to echo the sentiments of our dear John Gage here, who says, this is a time to envision a world without war, and this is a time to work like hell to get there. Thank you.
You notice there's a microphone right here. So if you're interested in asking a question, please come up to the microphone. Medea is going to conduct the Q&A session, but please make your questions short. A lot of people are going to want to ask questions here, and we have to be out of this sanctuary by 5. There will be a question and answer. There will be a book signing event in the social hall after the Q&A session. And then before that happens, Beverly Murphy will end this part of the presentation. So, and I also want to tell you that this session is being recorded. It will air on Solutions of Violence. It's a radio program on WFNP 106.5 FM radio, and it'll air this week, Monday at 5 p.m., Tuesday at 8 a.m., and Wednesday at 6 a.m. So, Medea, thank you. Question and answer.
I'm not quite sure how much background to give, except to say that I've paid really close attention to both of these conflicts, and I certainly would love to see peace and ceasefire and the same things you're calling for. I am just not sure that Putin has any intention of peace, and I think he has every intention of continuing to expand and do whatever it takes, because we've watched him level so many communities to the ground. And so I want to know what gives you confidence that negotiating with him would have any tenure and not just postpone the inevitable. Not that I know how to stop the guy, but I'm just saying I want to hear a reason why you think that's has some possibilities, please.
Sure. I think so, because there was a 15-point peace plan that both of them came up with. And the 15-point peace plan included Russian troops out, it included neutrality for Ukraine, it included internationally supervised elections in the Donbass, and it included putting the issue of Crimea off, because Zelensky knew that that's a very difficult one that the Russians weren't going to give into. I also think that the Chinese have tremendous leverage over Russia. Because of the sanctions, they're the ones that are buying the vast majority of the Russian oil. And we saw the Chinese put forward a peace plan. It wasn't a very detailed peace plan, it was basically a set of principles. That the Russians said, we're open to discussing those, just like Zelensky said, we're open to discussing those. But the US immediately came out and put the kibosh on China as a possible peacemaker. I think that if the US put the pressure on Zelensky and China put the pressure on Russia, I think peace talks could start. I also think that while the sanctions did not have the economic impact early on, I think they're starting to feel the economic impact. I think there is a growing opposition within Russia itself as this war drags on. I think that there is reason to believe that if those pressures were applied by the powerful nations, the US and China, those talks could begin. They could take a long time. We know in the case of Vietnam, peace talks took a long time. But I think we could see them started. And recognize there already have been talks with Russia and Ukraine about the grain deal. The Russians pulled out recently, but it had been successful for a while, and those talks are continuing with the help of Turkey. There have been talks about stopping the shelling that both sides accuse the other at the Zaporizhzhia plant, and allowed for the International Atomic Energy Agency to get into that plant. And there have been talks for prisoner swaps, and those happen constantly, where there are prisoner swaps, where there are exchanges between wounded soldiers, bodies of fallen soldiers happen. So I think peace talks could happen if enough pressure were put on both sides.
But my question is, do you think Putin wants long-term peace?
Yeah, I think both sides needs an off-ramp. At one time, Biden had said Putin needs an off-ramp. And I think that's very true. The United States has not provided that off-ramp, but there's plenty of things that the U.S. could offer. I think everybody needs an off-ramp at this point. And those off-ramps would come up if we move from the battlefield to the negotiating table.
It's well known that James Baker, the U.S. administration, promised Gorbachev not 1 inch east if they recognized German, East German independence. What makes you think this question here, that the U.S. is a negotiating partner, that you can rely on?
It's an excellent question, and all sides can point to instances in which negotiations were violated, treaties were violated. Certainly, the Minsk Agreement is an example in which it was violated. The agreement in which Ukraine was pushed to give up its nuclear weapons, saying that it wouldn't be invaded, was violated by Russia. The U.S. has signed negotiations. Let's look at the Iran nuclear deal with one administration, and then the next administration comes in and they pull out. There is no guarantee that any side will uphold its side of the negotiations. But first you need to start with the negotiations. And then you have to come up with the ways that those negotiations will be implemented. And I think at this point, with the global South becoming very powerful, and with other alliances like the BRICS and the global alliances in Latin America and in Africa, there are other parties, not just the US, that could try to hold the sides to an agreement. And I think that's one of the positive things we see in what is increasingly a multipolar world.
Medea, thank you for being here. And we're in Louisville, we're in the land of Anne Braden, and many people in this room were mentored by her, friends with her. And she often talked about the connection of war and racism and white supremacy. And certainly with all the problems that you've named in Congress, it's no accident, unless that list has changed, the last picture the Congress people have called on a ceasefire for all people of color. And when you talk about the role of the global South, there's predominantly populations of people of color. So there's definitely some connections in what you've already said, but could you say more about the role of racism and white supremacy in war and maintaining these systems?
Yeah, thank you, Pam. You know, we talk in this video a bit about the neo-Nazis, but you can talk about neo-Nazis and white supremacists not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia, and of course in the United States. And throughout Europe, it's an increasing danger. And part of that is that people are so disillusioned with their governments, just like people here voted for Trump. And we were just talking about, can you really vote for Biden at this point? People searching for alternatives, and these right-wing parties are growing, especially in Europe, that are saying we are the alternative. Increasingly dangerous. You ask, where are all these weapons that we are supplying to Ukraine going? Well, I think a lot of them are going into the hands of white supremacists. And we see more and more of these alliances of white supremacist groups that are arming themselves. And it's interesting, you brought up the fact, and I don't know if people quite understood, that there are now 18 members of Congress who have voted on a resolution introduced by Cori Bush to call for a ceasefire. Now, I think it's quite horrific that it's only 18 members of Congress. I mean, there are, counting the Senate, 535 members of Congress and only 18 members of Congress. But it is so interesting that every single one of them is a person of color. There is so far no white person in Congress that has signed that, and there is so far no Jewish member of Congress who has signed that, despite the huge protests that groups like Jewish Voice for Peace have had, or the young Jewish group called If Not Now has had. And I'm a member of the Jewish community, and we have been doing sit-ins in the office of other Jewish members of the Congress, including in the office just a couple of days ago of Jamie Raskin, saying that the Jewish members of Congress should be the first ones to come out and call for a ceasefire, the first ones to say not in our name, the first ones to recognize what this means in terms of growing anti-Semitism in this country, growing Islamophobia in this country. And traditionally, it has been the Black community that is the most anti-war community in the United States. Traditionally, it has been the Black members of Congress that have been the ones to introduce, like Barbara Lee, that we talked about, and Cori Bush, who comes from the community, who comes from the anti-police violence community. She is not an expert on Israel and Gaza, and she said, I don't have to be an expert on Israel and Gaza to know what is going on. It's absolutely wrong, and that it's people of color that are being killed. And so she has really created a fabulous movement that we can get behind. And we go behind all of these white members of Congress running after them and say, can you be the first white member of Congress to sign on to Cori Bush's resolution? So I think it is really important to recognize that the leadership in Congress is coming from people of color, Congress people of color, just like in our communities. We are finding the leadership not only against violence against racism, but also against spending all of this money on war is coming also from communities of color who really understand the connections all too well.
Where did we get the idea that you can't talk to Putin? Eisenhower talked to Stalin, Kennedy talked to Khrushchev, Nixon talked to Brezhnev, Reagan talked to Gorbachev. Recommended reading, a Kentuckian, Stephen F. Cohen, wrote the book War with Russia. It gives you plenty of relevant background to this conflict. And he died before the conflict started, but it's like it could have been written today.
Absolutely. And as I said, you have to talk to them. And the other is, how can you talk to Hamas? Which is something that many, 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 many people are saying. And I just want to say that you have to talk to Hamas. That you can't solve this without talking to Hamas. And Hamas has a political wing that has been trying to talk not only to Israel, but to leaders around the world for a long time, and been rebuffed every time they try to talk. And I know that from personal experience, having been in Gaza many times, and in one of the times, the people from Hamas asked to talk to the Jewish leaders in our group, who happened to be me and Norman Finkelstein, who some of you might know. And they wanted to talk about how they could change their relationship with the United States, and Obama had just come into power, and we said, write a letter to Obama saying you want to talk. And they laughed. They said, we've written to every single president the United States has had and said that we want to talk, and we get no response. We said, maybe Obama will be different. Give it a try. And sure enough, they wrote a beautiful letter saying, we want to talk. And we want you to look at what Israel has done based on international law. Look at what Amnesty International says, Human Rights says. Look at what are the violations and the war crimes that have been committed. And let's talk about international law. And they wrote it. We took it to the White House. We took it to the State Department. We took it to members of Congress. Zero response. And they simply told you they don't want to talk to us.
Jim Johnson, Solutions to Balance Radio. I've noticed since the beginning of the invasion by the Russians, the mainline news has not said a word. ABC, NBC, CBS, they have not said a word about the demands, some people call them demands, requests by Putin, move some of the military, U.S. military bases back, move some of the nuclear weapons back, don't admit Ukraine to NATO. Those things have just disappeared from the mainline news, and the same thing has happened with Israel and Palestine. So there was this controversy over the bombing of the Allied Baptist Hospital in the West Bank. And so the way the mainline news first stated that, well, it was not Israel, it was Palestine, it was Hamas that created that. But since then, Al Jazeera, for one, has brought in evidence that, well, maybe it was Israel after all. Now, once again, the mainline news is not saying a word about who bombed the hospital. Why is the mainline news so silent on issues that are controversial?
Well, they repeat a narrative that is coming from the White House. And in terms of who bombed that hospital, the Israelis are saying all of a sudden they know everything that happens inside Gaza where they didn't know on October 7th. And they're saying it's Islamic Jihad. I say let there be an international investigation, but we know that Israel is bombing clinics and hospitals every single day. We know they are bombing residential neighborhoods, marketplaces. They are bombing UN schools. I went the last time I was there to the Al-Shifa hospital, which was bombed by the Israelis. The children's ward was bombed by the Israelis. We know they are bombing civilians every single day. That is not a question. And so I think, some of that is getting out into some of the more mainstream media because it's hard to hide at this point. And I don't know about you, I have a very hard time watching the mainstream media. I watch Al Jazeera. I go to sites that are sites like Common Dreams. I watch Democracy Now! That I think has been doing a fabulous job reporting on this. But sometimes I'll turn on the mainstream media and you'll see some sneaking in of some Palestinian voices there because it's just become impossible not to portray in some fashion what's happened. But we know that we continue to see the hardships and truly horrible things that have happened to Israelis on October 7th. And horrible things about the hostages. But we don't see those kind of personalized stories about what happened every single day to the Palestinian people. We don't see the personalized stories that's been happening for decades. And if we did, I don't think the U.S. would be able to get away with giving $3.8 billion of our tax money every year to this apartheid, racist, genocidal regime. So I think we have to run up this part. So as we move into the next part, can I just say that we are dealing with two wars happening at the same time, but it's part of the militarization of our country that we have to focus on. We have to focus on the fact that we're spending $1 trillion of our taxes now on the military. We have to focus on the fact that our economy is a militarized economy. That our leaders don't represent us because they are constantly lobbied by this monster of a military-industrial congressional complex that we have allowed to be created in this country. I think this is a moment where, when we're looking for some kind of hope, I think it's a moment of the empire in severe decline. The empire is dying. The empire has backed itself into a terrible situation where we can no longer continue to spend $1 trillion of our money and expect to have thriving communities. And we cannot continue to think that this two-party system, where the two parties are war parties, can continue to exist without people rebelling and demanding real alternatives. And I think we're going to see it relatively soon, because I don't think people are going to be content to vote for a Trump or a Biden when it comes to the elections. We're going to demand alternatives. So I think this is a real turning point we're seeing in our country. And I hope and I pray that the turning point is something where people rise up and demand that the leaders of this country really do something for the people of this country, instead of spending our money to be killing more and more people and to be devising more horrific ways to kill people around the world. So that's the only hope that I see coming out of this, and I say this because it's a generational issue, and because young people do not believe the lies. Young people are so turned off by the system and so anxious to see something different, not a reform. They want to see some revolutionary changes in this country. So we hitch our wagon to the movement that is rising up from younger people in this country. I think we will have a better world. Thank you.
Before I give you some further instructions, is there anyone else who would like to ask a question of Medea? Yes, come over here, sir, please.
Hi, thank you for your presence, your words. I just wondered if maybe this is like a far out concept, but I wonder when you were talking about the environment, the lack of environmental kind of buy-in on anti-war stuff. I feel like the connection that you made about the mayors and the community, like where we are not spending our money. I think that the constant refrain you hear about the Green New Deal is like we don't have any. The United States doesn't have any money. We're the richest country in the world. So like, do you see any hope or possibility for like large war tax resistance that we're like, you know what I mean? Like the same thing that we've seen with the student debt relief, like the debtors collective. I don't know, I just wondered if you could speak to that as a tool for organizing.
Yeah, I think war tax resistance is great, just like I think things like the debtors collective is great. There are people that are actually talking about a global strike. And at first when, people started saying this, oh, we can't do that, we can't pull anything off like that. And now I'm hearing it more and more and more, people around the world saying we need some kind of global strike where we say, to the leaders of this country, what you have built is not working for us. Even the United Nations, what you have built is not working for us. So maybe that's what we're working towards. And when we see on this environmental issue, how come there's always money for war but not for the environment? I'm not only hearing that from young people in this country, but I'm also hearing it on the global level, where when you have the General Assembly and leaders of international of countries come forward and talk, they say, you promised $100 billion for a global fund for mitigation of the climate crisis that you and the wealthy countries have created, and you never put the money into it. And yet, like this, you spent over $100 billion on the war in Ukraine. So it's a global call for why is there always money for war. And, the US has said, you've never seen a stronger NATO than you have seen right now, with Sweden joining, Finland joining, and on one level that's true, but I predict that that's going to fall apart, because the joining NATO means you have to put more of your money into the military. And these are in communities where there are lots of big movements, especially of young people, saying, no, we want that money going into the environment. So I think we're going to see an unraveling of NATO as things go forward and people recognize we can't live where we put all this money into war instead of the environment.
Yeah, I have a very rhetorical question. With all the facts that you've stated and the facts that I know, since, our involvement in Afghanistan, even during Carter time, our involvement in Iran during Mossadegh, our involvement in every country in the world, in Latin America, Chile, with the murder of, several leaders and other important people in the world. Our involvement in killing Dag Hammarskjöld, our involvement in killing Patrice Lumumba, and I can't count more and more and more. Why is it so hard for us to recognize that since after the Second World War, we became the only colonizing power in the world? Why is it so hard for us to realize that? This is my question.
I would say because of the disservice that the mainstream media does in the narrative. I would say because we have one of the most corrupt political systems in this country where it takes millions of dollars to get elected, and so you are beholden to the big moneyed interests to get elected and then to stay in power. I mean, look at Israel, the largest foreign policy lobby in the United States is AIPAC. And AIPAC has the ability to take out congresspeople. If they don't like your position, they will put a primary contender up, or they will find a way to get you voted out. And so people are afraid in Congress of that. So between the media and a corrupt political system, we have this, and an educational system that does such a disservice. I mean, if every young person in this country could read Howard Zinn and other sources of information, we'd have a very different population. But I do want to end on the more positive note, because I think people are seeing through this. And I give the example of my Uber driver this morning, who is a black man in his 40s, somebody who doesn't pay a lot of attention to politics, and said to me, how can Israel get away with what it's doing? How can the American people believe that Israel is a good nation, given what it's doing to the Palestinians? And we had a great conversation, and he said, I don't listen to a lot of media, but I know that what's happening is wrong, and I know what my government is doing is wrong. And so I think a lot more people are seeing through this, and that's why we see the opinion polls that we see. It is quite remarkable, whether you're looking at Ukraine or whether you're looking at the issue of Israel, that the majority of people see through the mainstream narrative and say that we want to end these wars. The American people don't want to be in a constant state of war. And the American people don't want to see the United States trying to determine what happens all over the world. And Joe Biden, who continues to think that U.S. should be at the head of the table, I think the majority of Americans want the U.S. to take care of the people in this country and not to try to determine what other countries do. You can call that isolationist, but I'd rather have it be isolationist than going around the world giving weapons to Saudi Arabia and to Israel and to Egypt and all of these dictatorships around the world. And the other thing is, I also think that in terms of changing the narrative, this is a great time to really be educating people. Exactly what you said, the history of the United States. And while there are people like DeSantis and others who want to ban Students for Justice in Palestine and want to ban books and want to keep young people from reading and learning the truth, there are opposite forces right now. There are libraries being set up, I spend time in Florida, that are banned book libraries. Free libraries encouraging people to take a book that has been banned. So, you know, we see the opposite happening as well.
Hi. Would you like, can you ask her a question from where you are?
My name is Ira Cooper. In the 1960s, I was on the staff of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There are not very many of us left. But we learned that unless you combine the issues, the various issues, you'll get nowhere. You can't just tackle one thing and not the other. It was the movement of the African American community in particular, and the white community, but particularly the African American community, that helped build a cohesive, unified movement to try to change these things. It's happening now again, going backwards, because we have not learned that history. Did you know that there was an African American man who was part of SNCC who said, "No Vietnamese ever called me nigger"?
That's right. That's right.
That's the history that we need to teach people, and we're not doing it. And I commend you, Medea, for the work that you're doing. Thank you.
There is a part two to this program. The first part has just concluded, and because the church wants to set up for an evening program, we need to start moving out, but we want you to move to the social hall for part two. We have got more work to do here, more than simply clicking on the QR code on the inclusive, which I hope you've already done. When you go into the social hall, you're going to find 5 tables. Each table is devoted to a different topic. One is for the FOR. One is for signing a petition regarding negotiate now in Ukraine. One is for calling for ceasefire now in Gaza, Palestine, and Israel. And one, Alex, staffed by Alex from Carmichael's bookstore, where you're going to find him, and Medea sitting, where she's going to be autographing her books, and one that has some Halloween treats for us all. So, you all don't leave yet, just go into the social hall and we'll gather there again. Thanks so much.
If you do nothing else.
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 If you do nothing else.